This is a very strong message, a reminder.
The state of Israel was formed in 1948. All of this is actually part of a grand prophecy in the Holy Quran.
But there's also another decree which Allah has made in the Quran for Palestine. And the Muslims will come back. And the condition for that, Allah has made it very clear. And this is so important for Muslims to understand.
God doesn't say that we're going to give you back the power. He doesn't say that we're going to give Jews back the power over the land. In udtum udna. But if you return to your ways, then so will we. We'll return to our ways as well, and we'll punish you in the same way. It's so shocking that the oppression and the persecution that happened in the times of the Babylonians and the Roman, when they took over Jerusalem, they obliterated everything. The Muslims, however, when they took over Jerusalem, they were so peaceful and they were loving. How do we reconcile this?
Who is going to inherit the land? A lot of Muslims don't know that there's amazing prophecies in the Holy Quran about Palestine and who will inherit Palestine and what happened before with the Jews, what were the mistakes they did, and the fact that we have a Zionist movement there right now and what's going to happen in the future and what Muslims need to do to get Palestine back, because the Quran says that they will.
Exactly. And what we're seeing right now happening in the world, for example, the state of Israel was formed in 1948. All of this is actually part of a grand prophecy in the Holy Quran. And actually it's mind-blowing, because when we read it, we realize that everything that we're seeing now is part of this prophecy, and we can learn a lot from what has happened in history. So that's what we'll basically go through today. We'll take a look at this prophecy in the Holy Quran. So we'll go straight into it. The verse is in Surah Bani Israel, so also known as Surah Al-Isra. And verse 105, it actually says, وَقُلْنَا مِن بَعْدِهِ لِبَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ اسْكُنُوا الْأَرْضَ فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ جِئْنَا بِكُمْ لَفِيفًا. So this is an amazing prophecy. I'll read out the translation. And after him we said to the children of Israel, dwell ye in the land, and when the time of the promise of the latter days comes, we shall bring you all together.
Exactly.
So here the word Lafifa is used, and it's talking about the Bani Israel, that they will all be brought together. Now Lafifa, it means literally gathering everyone together. So they were, of course, we know the history, that they were all across the world, they were scattered. And it says in the latter days, they'll be brought together in the Holy Land of what we know today as Palestine or the state of Israel.
So many Muslims don't even know this, that this is a prophecy for the creation of the state of Israel, that the Jews are going to come back in the latter age, which we as Ahmadiyya Muslims believe is right now. And they're going to get this promised land, which is the land of Palestine, the Holy Land. Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad, Razillahu Anhu, the second Caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community, he spoke about these verses in a lot of depth. And he also brought in another verse that we have this prophecy in Surah Al-Isra, Bani Israel, 105, that the Jews are going to get together. But there's also another decree, which Allah has made in the Quran for Palestine. And that is in Surah Al-Anbiya. And this is what he does the Tafsir of and explains it in light with other verses of Surah Al-Isra or Bani Israel. And that is, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِن بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ. Meaning that, and we have already written in the book of David, after the reminder that my righteous servants shall inherit the land. So here there's two elements. There's something written in the Zabur, right? Psalms. And that is what's written there is a promise that the ultimate inheritors of the land of Palestine, the Holy Lands, are those people who will be the Salih, who will be the righteous servants of God. And this is so important for Muslims to understand, that it's not through might of military power, but it's through being righteous that Allah says you will inherit the land.
So essentially we find two decrees here. So the one that we mentioned before, that the Jews will gather in this land, and the other decree essentially is for the Muslims, that the Muslims will be the righteous inheritors of this land. So how do we reconcile this? So Hazrat Muslim Maud, Raziyallahu Ta'ala, he actually explains, he says that in the latter days a time will come where the Jews will come and inherit this land. And Muslims nowadays, people, they get quite worried. They're like, the Muslim world, the Muslim leaders, they've exhausted their powers. They've tried to put a stop to what we're seeing in Palestine today, but it just has not happened.
Yeah, like physically, militarily.
They've tried a lot of things. I mean, they've tried to sort of maybe even come together. They've tried all sorts of things, but from what we see, of course, it's apparent that nothing's happening, nothing's seeming to happen. But the reality is that they can try whatever they want, but unless they follow the second decree and they actually focus on, attaining piety and righteousness, they can't do anything because it's the decree of God. And without righteousness, nothing can happen. There can be no solution to this problem.
Exactly. And so I think it'll be interesting right here to unpack this element which the Quran says, وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ, that we have written in the Zabur, which is the Psalms, right? Okay. And the book of David. So in the Psalms, it's very clear in, I'll get it up here, in Psalms 37, verses 1 to 11. Now, it talks about this holy land that the Jews were promised, which was ultimately, first promised to Moses, and then after Hazrat Musa or Moses passed away, they did get it. Now, there's a number of things which obviously the listeners can read themselves as well. But, for example, in 9, it says, "For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land." And these whole verses, they're talking about having righteousness, staying away from evil.
There's conditional, basically.
There's conditions, right? Yeah. And basically going and following the path of Allah, right? Not going into evil.
Of course,
and transgression and cruelty. For example, trust in the Lord and do good. Commit your way to the Lord. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil. And then in 11 it says, "But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity." The meek, the humble.
The humble. And if we go slightly forward to verse 29, it categorically says it. Categorically it says, "The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell therein forever." So of course we have this promise here, but we have to remember that it's conditional. Righteousness, piety, sacrificing yourself in the way of the Lord. These are all conditions. And of course, what does this mean? If someone doesn't abide by these conditions, what would happen? They simply won't inherit the land. Or if they had inherited the land, what would happen is that land will be taken away from them. So this is what we want to get into. We want to go into the history of this. It's actually a very rich and a very interesting history because, the relationship of the Jews with the Holy Land of Palestine, it's a very interesting one. So they had it at one point, then it was taken away from them, then they had it again, and then again it was taken away from them. And this whole situation is mentioned not only in the Bible, but in the Holy Quran and in great detail.
Exactly.
And that's what we'll get into now.
So I think so. Let's just jump right in. So, Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad Raziyallahu Anhu, our second Khalifa, he bases the exegesis on Surah Al-Anbiya, verses 106 and 107. And then he brings in Surah Bani Israel or Al-Isra and speaks about 105. And this is, of course, if you're counting Bismillah, and also from 5 to 9 rather. And what's important, just before we get into this, the verse of Surah Al-Anbiya that we have written in the Zabur, that the Ibadiyya Salihun, the righteous servants, will get the land. The next verse, 107, says, "Inna fi hadha la balaghan liqawmin abidin."
Exactly.
That this is a very strong message, a reminder for those people who are worshippers. Who are those? Who's the Quran referring to first and foremost?
Of course, the Muslims, of course.
Right? So the Muslims are being told here that we wrote in the Zabur that only the righteous servants will inherit the land, ultimately. And the Jews were initially, they were the chosen people.
Of course,
but they moved away from this. They moved away from righteousness. They lost it on a number of occasions, which we're going to talk about. And Allah is reminding the Muslims that you then have to remember, you have to be an abid, a worshipper of Allah. and you will then get it. So it's like a reminder for the Muslims. And this is what our second Caliph was explaining, that it's a massive reminder for the Muslims to learn from. It's a lesson from them.
Definitely.
For them not to follow the way of the Jews.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned follow the way of the Jews, because this is actually prophesied so clearly in the Holy Quran and the Ahadith that the Muslims will follow in the footsteps essentially of the Jews.
Yeah.
So for example, the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was sent as a prophet the same way that Moses was sent to the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
He's given a likeness to Prophet Moses in the Holy Quran. And in the Ahadith, we find that the Muslim people in the latter days, they will follow the Jews the same way that one shoe is the same as another shoe.
Yeah.
So we know this is going to happen, and this has been told by the Holy Prophet and the Holy Quran. So it is really up to us, a huge responsibility. We have to learn, we have to study, we have to learn from what they did wrong, so that we can't make the same mistake again. Yeah. And the only way we can do that is if we look into these verses, we study them, and we realize where they went wrong, where they started to transgress, and where they sort of didn't, uphold the conditions that they were meant to.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lesson. And just another point Hazrat Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad Razillahu Anhu raises is that actually this prophecy, which we're going to go into about the Jews getting the land, then Allah taking it away from them, it was actually mentioned in Deuteronomy as well.
Yeah.
So Musa alayhi salam, Moses, he warned the Jews of this. And then the Quran makes mention of it as well. So I think we should just jump right into these verses.
Let's go straight into it.
So let's open up, I think we'll start from Surah Al-Isra, Bani Israel, verses 5 to 9. And all those listening as well can just kind of join in with us as well.
Yeah, so if we go straight down to verse 5, that's where it starts, and I'll just read this out. وَقَدَيْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ فِي الْكِتَابِ لَتُفْسِدُنَّ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَّتَيْنِ وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًا كَبِيرًا. So I'll translate it in English. And we revealed to the children of Israel in the book, saying, you will surely do mischief in the land twice, and you will surely become excessively overbearing. So, and you will excessively become overbearing. So here it's clear that, twice they will do mischief in the land, meaning that, of course, the conditions that were mentioned before, piety, righteousness, is very clear here that they won't uphold them. And it's mentioning twice this will happen. And then it goes on to say, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ أُولَاهُمَا بَعَثْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ إِبَادًا لَنَا أُولِي بَأْسٍ شَدِيدٍ. So when the time for the first of the two warnings came, we sent against you some servants of ours who possessed great might in war. So here, if we just talk through this, it talks about twice they're going to do mischief and they're going to transgress in the land, meaning that they'll be punished twice as well.
Exactly.
Now, if we take a look at the history, the Holy Land of Palestine, or Canaan at that time it was, they were the owners of this land. They had power over this land. But when they went against the commandments of God for the first time, it was taken away from them. And that's exactly what it refers to here. It says, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ أُولَاهُمَا. So when the time for the first of the two warnings came, then a people were made to come into the land who took over the land, and they were overbearing and they were very mighty in war.
And not just mighty in war. They said, the verse continues. It says that these people who will come in and take the land away from the Jews, it said that, and they penetrated the innermost parts of your houses, and it was a warning that was bound to be carried out. This is referring to the Babylonian captivity, or the Babylonian exile, as it's called as well, which happened in 586 to 87, when the Babylonians, they came in and they basically exiled the Jews, a lot of the Jews, to Babylon. Not just that, they destroyed Jerusalem, they killed Jews, they put them into slavery. There's a whole history behind this, which everyone can read up on. But the Quran said that, is reminding the Jews that you guys did this, you went against Allah, you weren't righteous, and then the Babylonians came in, right? Which is وَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ أُولَاهُمَا.
That's it.
The first promise, when it was fulfilled, that's when the Babylonians came in, and they destroyed the whole area.
They destroyed everything. The first temple of Solomon, they completely destroyed that.
Exactly.
And they sort of wreaked havoc in the land. And this was in the time of Nebuchadnezzar II. So like you mentioned, 586. And then, but then of course the Quran says that after the first warning, then the land was given back to the Jews when King Cyrus came and he took over and he sort of brought back the Jews from their exile in Babylon. And this is mentioned in the Holy Quran as well. It says that ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَا لَكُمُ الْكَرَّةَ, and we gave you back the power against them. So very clearly it's saying that, you know, they gave back the power and we aided you with wealth and children and made you large in numbers. So the first promise is done. So of course they went into exile. The mosque was destroyed. Sorry, the place of worship was destroyed. The Temple of Solomon, everything. There was a lot of destruction, but they ended up getting power back. So the first time this is what happened, then the Jews came back into the Holy Land.
Yeah, they rectified themselves as well spiritually. That's it. Right. And they stopped their evil ways. Of course, the evil ways are going against the commandments of God.
Yeah.
And King Cyrus the Great, he gave them a lot of refuge. They built back the Temple of Solomon.
That's it.
There was, you know, they were given the respect back, and they were inheritors of the land once again.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next verse, verse 8 of Surah Al-Isra, Bani Israel, the Quran says, it reminds the Jews that if you do well, you will do well for your own souls, right? Yeah. So if you're following the path of Allah, it's only going to benefit you. But if you don't do well, then what's going to happen? And if you do evil, it will only go against them, right? So when the time for the latter warning came, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ, the second warning now come, right? وَعْدُ الْأُولَى has already come. The second warning is coming now. We raise the people against you to cover your faces with grief, and to enter the mosque as they entered it the first time, and to destroy all that they conquered with utter destruction. So the Jews are now being, they're facing the wrath of Allah for a second time, and they're getting taken out of the promised land of Palestine yet again.
So and this is after rectifying themselves the first time. Yeah. When the first punishment came, they rectified themselves, and they went a long time. They were good. But then when the Messiah came, when Jesus ﷺ came, he was sent by Allah the Almighty to revive the Mosaic dispensation. But of course they rejected him. They went against the commandments of God. And for that reason, the second punishment then came down. And that was when, it was 70 years after the Messiah came, Titus, the Roman emperor. So the Romans, they took over Jerusalem. And like it says in the Quran, utter destruction. They took over the places of worship. We even find in history, if we take a look, I mean, they slaughtered pigs inside the mosques. So it was complete humiliation. It was utter destruction. And
in fact, historians have also said that the destruction was so much that all of Jerusalem was full of just murder, famine, and also some say cannibalism as well.
Wow.
So it was just utter destruction. They burnt down the temple again. They
and this was after it was rebuilt.
Yeah, so this was after it was
they
rebuilt.
brought them back, and then they rebuilt it, and then they just destroyed it again. Yeah,
exactly. And also they prohibited the Jews from coming in. In fact, at that time, Emperor Hadrian, he actually put in a lot of efforts to get rid of the Jewish identity. Again, they were going in, murdering everyone. They were going into the temple and disrespecting it. The Jews were exiled yet again. And this is the second promise of God, which was fulfilled.
So now if we carry on with the verses, here we actually find something really, it's quite subtle, but if we take a look at it, we realize what's really going on. So the second time round, God doesn't say that we're going to give you back the power. He doesn't say that we're going to give Jews back the power over the land. He just says, Asa Rabbukum an yarhamakum. And it may be that your Lord will now have mercy on you. And then it says, In udtum udna. But if you return to your ways, then so will we. We'll return to our ways as well, and we'll punish you in the same way. Now, this rehem, this mercy that God talks about, the first time round when the punishment came, the Jews came back. King Cyrus brought them back into the land, and they were once again, they had power over the land. But this time round, when the Romans invaded, they didn't actually gain back the land. All that happened was that the Roman emperor, it was quite a long, they differ on this, but about 200, 300 years, some say, they had invaded Jerusalem. But eventually what happened is that the Roman emperor at the time, he became a Christian.
Yeah, Constantine,
exactly. And this was a mercy from God, because although he was a Christian, he wasn't a Jew, but we know that Christians, of course, they have a lot of respect for the Jewish prophets, also, all the prophets.
Also, they are a group from within Judaism.
Exactly. Right? Jesus was, he was from the Mosaic dispensation.
Exactly.
Anyway.
And so it's interesting. And what the second Khalifa says, Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad Raziyallahu Anhu, he says that it's interesting because the Quran doesn't say that they will become the inheritors of the land. It says that they will be shown mercy. Now, what does that mean? They'll be shown mercy.
Yeah.
The mercy is removing the disrespect or the hatred, aversion that people had towards the Jews.
Yeah.
And how was this disrespect removed? It was by the Roman emperor, accepting Christianity, and as a result then, Christians respecting Jews and their prophets.
Yeah, everything about them. The prophets, the Torah, they had respect for it.
Exactly, they included it within their own holy books, the Torah and the Bible, right?
Yeah.
So that's the mercy which Allah is talking about in this verse, which our second Khalifa points to, which is such an amazing point. It's so sublime, and a lot of Muslims, I'm sure, have never even heard of this tafsir or this understanding of the Holy Quran.
Yeah, but then also he does say, in udtum udna, that if you return, then we will return as well. And of course, God wouldn't just say something for no reason.
Yeah.
It of course
so in return here, what do you mean?
So return basically meaning that if you return back to your old ways, i.e. if you continue to transgress, or if you deviate from the path of God, then we too will return to our ways, what we did before, i.e. we punished you, and punishment basically.
Yeah.
And why would God say this? I mean, if it wasn't going to happen in the future, then why would this be here?
So this is a good segue to bring in the Muslims. Where do the Muslims come in? Remember in Surah Bani Israel, our second Khalifa explains that in Surah Bani Israel, later on in 105, Allah makes it clear to everyone that the ibadi as-salihun, that the righteous servants will inherit the Holy Lands. Now, with the arrival of Islam, of course, the Muslims are the righteous servants as per the Holy Quran. And the Jews and the Christians, they reject the Holy Prophet ﷺ. What happens? Allah gives the Holy Land to the Muslims during the time of Hazrat Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, who goes into Palestine in a very peaceful way. It's not at the destruction of the Babylonians and the Romans. And actually the clergy and the priests, they want him there, right? Yeah. They ask him to pray in their church, which of course he rejects, because he says that if I do this, then my own ummah, my own people, they might in the future say that this is ours because our Khalifa prayed it.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's so peaceful. That's why we find it so shocking. And as a Muslim that actually writes this as well, it's so shocking that the oppression and the persecution that happened in the times of the Babylonians and the Roman, when they took over Jerusalem, they obliterated everything.
Yeah.
The Muslims, however, when they took over Jerusalem, they were so peaceful and they were loving. But yet in the West now, even historians, when they write their books, they literally paint Muslims to be the bad people. And the Roman Empire, they talk about the victories and how amazing they were, when in reality, they were the ones who destroyed the places of worship. They slaughtered pigs in them. And Muslims, they were so peaceful and loving.
Exactly. So, and this is what is the hypocrisy and this inherent prejudice in the Judeo-Christian kind of mindset against Muslims, right? The Romans, the Babylonians, they destroyed the whole area of Judea.
Yeah.
But when the Muslims came in, it was very peaceful. And in fact, during that whole reign then, when Muslims were reigning it for about over 1,300 years, there were Jews, Christians, and Muslims were living peacefully in the land of the Holy Lands, which we're now, since obviously 75 years, we're just seeing it's just turmoil after turmoil and destruction. But this didn't happen during the time of the Muslim era.
And as a Muslim, of course, he doesn't just mention his own tafsir, he brings in references from other people, from Western historians, all the way down to other mufassirin and other exegetes of the Holy Quran. For example, this point that we just mentioned about the Roman Empire being praised and glorified, he quotes Edward Gibbon, who is an English historian, and he's written a book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Very famous. In that, he paints the Roman Empire to be a very, like a good empire who didn't do any sort of bad whatsoever. But we know from history that when they took over Jerusalem, they did all of that. They destroyed the mosque, they slaughtered pigs in there. Muslims, on the other hand, they were peaceful and they all lived together in harmony.
Yeah.
But then why is it now that Muslims are the ones that get the brunt of it and they get all the hatred?
And as a Muslim, so our second Caliph, he mentions this really interesting point as well. He says that when the Ibadiyya Salihun, the righteous servants inheriting the land, the Muslims inheriting the land is mentioned, it doesn't talk about destruction. In the first two promises, the Babylonians coming in, destroying everything, the Romans coming in, destroying everything. But because the Muslims were the true inheritors of Musa alayhi salam, of Dawood, Sulaiman, all these prophets of God, they were the true people who were following the message of Musa, right? And the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Isa. So they became the true inheritors, not the people who were rejecting.
Right.
Now, if we go forward, so the question is, what happened after that?
So if we fast forward now to this day and age, the question that a lot of people now are asking, that it seems as though Muslims have been sort of, put on the side. There's a lot of oppression going on in Palestine at the moment. And it seems as though that Jews have inherited the land. So rightfully so, people are asking, are Jews the rightful inheritors of this land, the righteous servants, as mentioned in the Holy Quran?
Exactly. So, look, this is Hazrat Muslim Maud, our second Khalifa. He mentions a really interesting point. He says, look, when the Babylonians came in, were they the righteous servants of the land? No, they weren't.
Not,
At that time, they neither the Jews, neither the Babylonians. Then when the Romans came in, were they righteous? No, they weren't. So a temporary cessation or a temporary pocket of time where the land is given to someone else doesn't mean that those people living there are the righteous servants.
Yeah, and besides, even if you look at it, in terms of years, the state of Israel was created in 1948.
Yeah.
From
been
then,
75 years.
From then until now, it's only been 75 years. In comparison, if you look back then, when the Babylonians took over, 150 years, 200 years even we find, 100 years, however long it was. Then when the Romans came, 200, 300 years, that's nothing compared to the 75 years that we see right now. So for people to get worried if they see 75 years, it seems as though the Jews they have the land, even though we know that it's actually the Christians. They're being funded by America and the Russia and all these other powers. But 75 years is nothing compared to that. So Hazrat Muslim actually mentions this as well in his Tafsir.
Exactly. So now if we're going forward, so what's going to happen? Historically, what happened is during the time of Hazrat Umar, we got the Holy Lands. Then Muslims lost it during the Crusade eras, right? During the Crusade time period, which was 1099, they lost it for about 80 years.
Right.
Now we need to come back to this verse of Surah Bani Israel. And this is where the end kind of comes into play, and then we can kind of amalgamate everything together and join it together. So in this, the Quran is saying, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ, when the promise of the latter days comes in. Now, this is completely separate from the two promises made earlier in this surah, because they've already been fulfilled. This clearly is referring to something else. It's a second promise of a latter time. And so the question is, what is this about? And this is where Allah is saying that we will bring the Jews together. جِئْنَا بِكُمْ لَفِيفًا, that when the second promise comes of the latter days, we will bring you together. So the question is, what's going on here? Our second Khalifa explains in a very beautiful way. He says, look, the Jews in the Holy Quran are on par, they're going to follow, the Muslims are going to become like the Jews. And the Holy Prophet ﷺ in the Holy Quran is actually, the Quran says that we have sent to you a prophet from among you, as we sent to Pharaoh, a prophet as well. So the Quran has made a resemblance between Hazrat Musa and the Holy Prophet ﷺ. They both brought divine laws, and their people. And of course, from Ahadith, like you mentioned, that the Holy Prophet ﷺ said that the Muslims will become like the Jews.
Yeah, and the 1300 years. So after Moses, 1400 years after the Messiah, the first Messiah came, after the Holy Prophet, we believe as Ahmadiyya Muslims that the Messiah came, the promised Messiah came.
So the Jews had two promises, that they will get taken out the land when they aren't righteous servants of God. And they were fulfilled. Now, our second Khalifa says that because Jews and Muslims are given a resemblance in the Holy Quran and in the Hadith, and in fact the end of Surah Al-Fatiha, the Muslims also had 2 punishments that were going to await them, which will cause them to leave the land. And it was a time when they wouldn't be righteous. The first was during the Crusades in 1099, when the Muslims were drawn out, and the Crusaders stayed there for about 188 years. Then the Muslims came back at the time of Salahuddin Ayyubi. Then the second time, the Muslims were drawn out again, like the Jews were drawn out a second time as well from the Holy Lands. And that was the time of 1947, 1948, the creation of Israel.
Yep.
So then the question is now, who is going to inherit the land? And our second Caliph makes it very clear that because the Quran says that Ibadi as-Salihun, the righteous servants, will inherit the land, this current condition that we're going through right now, where the Zionist movements and the Christians and the Jews have all got together and they're controlling Palestine, they're controlling the Holy Lands, it's a temporary period. And the Muslims will come back. And the condition for that, Allah has made it very clear that in Surah Al-Anbiya, that Ibadi as-Salihun, the righteous servants, are the ones who are going to inherit it, and that's the condition for the Muslims to follow, not militarily to go out and fight, and because they've done it, right? Historically, Muslim Arab countries have fought Israel, and Israel took over more land. So now, which the Quran is very clear about, is that if you want the land, it's gonna have to be through spiritual and moral change. And it's interesting because our second Caliph explained that this verse, that we will bring you back, talking to the Jews, will gather you together, is actually was meant to be during the time of the Messiah. Other Mufassirun have said this. And it's interesting because it actually happened 1300 years after the time of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. And also the Jews lost Israel ultimately during the time of the Romans 1300 years after Moses. So there's a resemblance here.
And at the moment, at the first time when the Romans invaded Jerusalem, what was the main reason for that? The Jews at the time, they rejected the Messiah who was meant to come and revive them.
Exactly.
Right now, we see the dire state of the Muslim world. There's disunity is rampant, right? The Messiah has come, the promised Messiah came into this world. He was the reviver for Islam, but the majority of the Muslim world, they've rejected him. So in order to be a true righteous servant of Allah, you have to find, there's many ahadith about this. When the Messiah comes, you have to find him. Even if you have to travel to mountaintops and go far and wide, you have to recognize the Messiah and you have to accept him. And then you have to strive to make yourself righteous. And this is the only way that Muslims can succeed. And they will succeed. The second Khalifa says it so clearly, so confidently in the Tafsir. He says that nothing can stop this victory from happening. No atom bomb, no any kind of bomb. America, Russia, none of these powers that we see right now, they're of course all together. They're trying to make this
coalition.
Coalition. They're all coming together and they're sort of supporting Israel, you can say. And Muslims at the moment, it seems as though they don't have any sort of power. But a time will come when they will have power and they will take this holy land back. But that is only provided that they take the right means that are mentioned in the Holy Quran. And that is that they purify themselves and they strive to become the righteous servants of Allah the Almighty.
Exactly. And this is something which our current Khalifa and our Khulafa in the past have been reiterating whenever the issue, when Palestinians are being persecuted by the Jews in Israel. He always says that, number one, unity, that Muslims should come together. But most importantly, that we Muslims themselves have to create a change within themselves. Until that doesn't happen, and it will happen, inshallah, in the future. But until that doesn't happen, the Muslims are not going to get the Holy Lands again like that.
Because they're going against the decree that God mentioned in the Holy Quran.
Exactly. And the decree is clear. The Ibadi as-Salihun, the righteous servants of God, will get the Holy Land.